Well, thank you all very much. It's great to be in Grand Rapids. I'm from Texas, so it's nice to see snow. I don't complain about it. I enjoy it. And it's especially great to be here with all of you and to be introduced by Richard, who, as he mentioned, I've known now for 13 years. And I'm trying to think of a funny story I can tell about Richard. Of course, most of them I can't tell. I'd have to clean them up a bit. When I first met him at the Reagan Library, he asked me where I was from, and I said Texas, and he said, "Oh, is this your first trip into civilization?" So that began a 13-year friendship, and the only thing I can say about Richard is that in addition to being the greatest historian I've ever read, he's one of the greatest friends I've ever had. And I'm very grateful for him being here tonight. I'm also very grateful for all of our hosts, for Grand Valley State, for the Office of Multicultural Affairs, for all of the folks here at the Ford Library Museum, for Elaine DDA, and Gleaves, Whitney, of course, for arranging this and making this event possible. And I also want to thank Mandy and Heather, who helped me make my way through the snow these last couple of days. That was very much a blessing to me. Richard is absolutely right. It is entirely appropriate to be here tonight at this library to discuss this topic. There is a scene in the book where young Congressman Jerry Ford sends a very impassioned letter to President Eisenhower after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which called for the first ever creation of a Civil Rights Commission. And Jerry Ford wrote a letter to the president wondering why he was not more quickly getting about the business of appointing the commission. Civil rights was an issue that Congressman Ford cared about, and later President Ford cared about. And as Richard mentioned, President Eisenhower in many ways was a hero and a role model to President Ford, as all of you know. So it is very appropriate to be here at this library and to talk about this joke. I want to begin by saying that it is very odd in some ways to be a speechwriter talking about Eisenhower, because Eisenhower thought very little of people like me and people like Gleaves and people like Richard. Eisenhower once joked to an aide that if speeches were important to leadership, then the American people ought to elect Hemingway. And what he meant by that is that actions speak louder than words. And as a former military man, he very carefully tried to go about the business of governing in a very serious, a very thoughtful, and a very methodical way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There was a very deliberate anti-rhetorical strategy that Eisenhower had. But nevertheless, I've been drawn to this story for many, many years. I remember first mentioning this to Richard 13 years ago, that I was fascinated by the story of Eisenhower and Little Rock. Eisenhower once said to Stephen Ambrose in an oral history that sending troops into Little Rock was the hardest thing he ever did. It was harder than D-Day. And yet, as I got into the researching and the writing of this book, what I discovered is I became less interested in Little Rock and more interested in Eisenhower. This book began for me as a case study of Central High in 1957. It transformed into a character study of Dwight David Eisenhower. This book began as a foray into policy making, and it reemerged as a profile in soul searching. In simple terms, Ike's Final Battle, the book that I produced, is the story of how the greatest American hero of his time was forced to grapple with the greatest American dilemma of all time. Here is the story of Dwight Eisenhower, hero of D-Day, most beloved American in the world of his time, coming to terms with an issue so difficult that it had bewildered Americans dating all the way back to even the brilliance of the Founding Fathers. No one had figured out how to make the promise of the Declaration true for everyone. No one had figured out how to deal with the birth defect of the American Republic. And it falls to Dwight Eisenhower, not only in his military career, but especially in his presidency, to deal with the issue of race and civil rights. Now, I have a theory about history that if you want to study the best of leaders, look at them during the worst of their times. Look at them when they're struggling with an issue that's very difficult and very intractable, and see how they work through the problem. And so I came to civil rights to see what it says about Eisenhower. And in the course of writing this book, I became convinced that this was a great character study that speaks to us even today. I wrote not a political history or even really a traditional biography, but a character study of an action leader in the middle of a crisis, dealing with a great issue, wrestling with it, and trying to get it right. And I argue in the end, he does get it right, and Dwight Eisenhower is a reluctant hero on civil rights. So what I want to do tonight is answer 3 questions for you. And I think these 3 questions speak very closely to the issue at hand, which is Eisenhower wrestling with civil rights. Why did he do what he did? Why was he slow? How did he act? What was he thinking of? What were the issues that were important to him, both as general and as president? And so rather than recount every step of the Little Rock crisis or every civil rights battle along the way, what I want to do is focus on his journey and answer 3 questions in broad terms. First, what did Eisenhower believe on civil rights? Second, how did he approach the issue as a leader and manager? And third, and maybe most interestingly to all of you fans of history, why has he never gotten any credit? So let's start with the first question. What did he believe on civil rights? As President, Eisenhower was fond of saying that segregation was criminally stupid, but he had not always felt that way. By the time he became president, he had journeyed a long way on race. And indeed, the book is really the story of a trajectory. It's the story of a direction, of a person heading forward and changing his position and evolving over time. When Eisenhower emerges from West Point in 1916, he's assigned to Fort Sam Houston in Texas. And here we see one of his first encounters with people of color, with African American troops. He's asked to train a group of Illinois National Guard troops who happen to be African American. He is shocked at how poorly they shoot their guns, and he comments later that at that moment, he, quote, took it for granted that black people were stupid. 2 decades later, in the 30s, he finds himself again dealing with troops of color and again finding himself unimpressed. This time he's in the Philippines. This time he's serving with MacArthur. And he's training Filipino troops. And he writes in his diary that he's learned to, quote, expect a minimum of performance from a maximum of promise. But Eisenhower, as I mentioned earlier, begins to change. He begins to rethink this issue and to become a completely different person on matters of race. Where did the change begin? It began during World War II. As Eisenhower is leading forces in Europe, he notices several interesting developments around him, and he's always been a very observant man. He notices first the courage of the Tuskegee Airmen. He hears about a great battle they've had in the skies, and he goes in person to congratulate the men of the unit. He later finds out about a black soldier condemned to death for sleeping with a white civilian. He thinks this is silly, and he suspends the judgment, saving the man's life. He even lifts press prohibitions on how African American troops are covered, essentially mandating that both black troops and white troops get the same media coverage. But the greatest change of all comes from the greatest battle of all, and that's the Battle of the Bulge. After the Nazis successfully pushed back his line in late 1944 and early 1945, Eisenhower is desperate for troops. And he looks around and tries to figure out where he can find more troops. And so he issues an order that violates War Department policy and allows African American troops who are supposed to be in the back and support units and allows them to go to the front. Years later, he says to a friend that this was a huge turning point for him because he saw the courage of these soldiers signing up to go to the front. And he says to an aide years later, and these are his words, "The thing I will never forget is the sacrifice of those black soldiers at the Battle of the Bulge." World War II changes Eisenhower, but it also changed the civil rights movement. Soldiers who went to the front of the line in battle weren't eager to go to the back of the bus in Birmingham. And so upon their return, you see the civil rights movement beginning to take on new momentum all throughout the nation, particularly in the South. And you begin to see new leaders like Thurgood Marshall emerging, taking the civil rights fight into new arenas such as public schools. But here's the other interesting thing about Ike and his unwitting leadership on the issue. Because of the changes implemented during the Army during World War II, the War Department studies his changes and decides that the changes worked pretty well. A report is issued called the Gillum Report, which explicitly studied Eisenhower's use of black troops and decides that maybe segregated units don't make sense anymore. This eventually leads to the Charles Wilson Commission, which issues the famous report to secure these rights, which eventually leads to President Truman's Executive Order 9981, calling for the desegregation of the military.